Welcome to today's Goggio lecture. It's a great pleasure to welcome back our Goggio professor, our distinguished Goggio professor for this year, Jayne, whom we saw already in the fall for 2 lectures, and continues her series of lectures on the theme of companionship with her talk today. So it's a great pleasure back in our community to continue this conversation that started last fall. The title of her talk today is Companionship of in the Arts, Books of Hours, Monteverdi's Music and Ottaviani's Chaos. Professor Tylus is Andrew Downey Orrick Professor of Italian and Professor of Comparative Literature and of Divinity at Yale. Her primary interests are in late medieval and early modernity, especially as regards issues of leadership, women's literature, and religious studies. Her books include Women's Literature, Early Modernity's Orphan Texts, which is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press, Siena City of 2015, and Reclaiming Caterina of Siena, which won the 2010 MLA's Howard Marano Prize for Best Book in Italian Studies, and Writing Ability in the Late Renaissance of 9. She recently translated Dacia Maraini's Chiara di Assisi, Elogio della Disobbedienza, for the series Other Voices in Italian Literature, published in 2023, and she also translated the complete poems of Gaspara Stampa and Lucrezia Tornabuoni. Her previous appointments were the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she served Associate Dean of the Humanities and Arts, and at New York University, where she was founding director of the Center for the Humanities and Vice Provost for Academic Affairs. As I mentioned, the title of her talk today, Companion of in the Arts, Books of Hours, Monteverdi's Music, and the Ottaviani's Chaos.
Thank you, Luca.
Jayne Tylus.
Great. Now, thanks on who's here today. I know you just had your pausa, your reading week, and so getting into the swing of things. As you'll see, I changed my title slightly for today's talk, still sticking with the text that Luca just mentioned. But it's very much for me an experiment, not only an experiment insofar as I'm not a film expert, I'm not a music expert, I don't really do painting, and that's what this talk is full of today. But also because I've never shown clips of the type I'm going to be showing you right now, as we start from Pirandello's Chaos, where a wonderful crow is very sadly being tormented by a group of shepherds on a mountain. Some of you might remember this from this film of the Taviani brothers. And then a very compassionate shepherd steps in to help. And regrettably, the clip that I found on YouTube, I'm not smart enough to make clips myself, otherwise you would have had more of this scene. But the clip that I found gives us the scene that starts right after this compassionate shepherd has intervened to save this poor corvo, this poor crow, from the other shepherds who were really maltreating him. And they're maltreating him because he is a hen who they found sitting on a nest of eggs. And, que maschio, right? Sitting, doing the job of a woman. So they're tormenting this crow. This one shepherd, pulls him out of the hands of one of the shepherds who's kind of beating him. And we'll see what happens next. How many of you have seen Chaos, the Taviani 5 novelle of Pirandello? Well, louder, you'll have to tell us a lot about it later. But we're going to start with that. And as you're watching what happens to the crow, what this corvo does, I want you to be thinking of the shepherd utters right before the scene that I have for you starts. And the word is not found in Pirandello's novella, which is called The Crow from Mizaro, Il Corvo di Mizaro, but a word that the Taviani brothers put in, which is simply the word musica. And he says it twice, musica. So on to this first clip. If I can start it. These are the bad shepherds who are tormenting the corvo. Okay, sorry to disrupt your watching of this great film. Let me make sure it gets stopped. Yeah. So the crow gets the bell after the shepherd has uttered twice musica. Sometimes what the crow is saying, we get this kind of, nice view from the sky. Then we also use where we're actually looking up at the crow. So we're both simultaneously enjoying his flight by watching it, but also enjoying his flight by being part of it until the shepherd utters zika, which is about 3-4 minutes into the film. There's no soundtrack. So the music, the soundtrack that appears in the film only appears as of this moment when the Campanello is put around the Corvo's neck and the Corvo is released into the sky. I want to just use this. I'll be coming back to Pirandello and to Caus later in my remarks this afternoon. But I want to kind of use this scene as a bit of a prompt. And the prompt is kind of this. How does the addition of sound and images where to us, but also if it takes us into new places, what does it mean that it also might be taking us far from, quote, the original text? And in this case, it's both the novella, which is about this very crow, the Corvo di Mizero, but it's also in the course of about 5 other novellae that Pirandello wrote over a period of about 20 or 25 years. What does it do when we add things to words that are already there? It is about betraying the author's intentions by bringing something quite foreign into his or, and I want to come back here to a citation that I used, I gave my last talk on translation back in November. Is it more along the lines of what George Steiner, the great scholar of translation, said in his fabulous book After Babel, which he wrote in the 70s, as in great translation, so in a great musical setting, and this is the kind of musical setting we've just seen in Caus, something is added to the original text, but that which is added, Steiner goes on, suggesting in maybe a kind of utilitarian, maybe a mystical way, that which is added was already there. I'd like to kind of frame our conversation this afternoon about, a kind of translation that Steiner alludes to very briefly in a work that's really literary translation. The translation I'd love for us to be thinking about today is when we translate a text to another medium, whether it's visual, whether it's musical, whether it's cinematic, whether it's dramatic. How does that translation audience, but what might the original author have thought? Would he or she have as adding what's already there? Or would he or she have seen it as a way of distancing the original text from its proper origins, as it were? So seeing this wonderful beginning to Caus with the release of the Corvo, and I'll tell you how Pirandello actually adds this novella, because we can talk about this in the Q&A. There's quite an almost a tragic moment that after he's released in the novella, the Taviani don't give us that moment. They give us the beginning, the release of the crow, and they kind of give us the sentiment of the end, right? The Corvo di Mizero, here it is in this beautiful morning. We could hear it, right? As it's going through the heaven, the sound of its campanella. It's a bird that is now libero e beato. So the sense that, we begin the novella with the Corvo who's being tormented by shepherds. He's released, something else happens I won't go into here, a kind of bitter, tragic, but the novella ends with the Corvo flying freely into the skies, libero and beato. So as I introduce you to Pirandello, and I'll be moving backwards into a period which I know a little bit better, the late medieval moment and the Renaissance moment, I'll kind of be breaking my own disciplinary frame today by rather wildly into genres in which I have like zero experience. One being film, another being early modern opera. But as I do this, I'd really like to focus mainly on sonoric or sonic correspondences and dimensions. Like the crow and the bell add to this novella when we actually hear him and kind of see him flying. But I also want to explore what we might consider to be the process of artistic or crossbreeding, collaboration, that is to say, among different genres, obviously among different kinds of artists, narrators, cinematic geniuses like the Taviani, musicians, composers, and so forth. There are, of course, geniuses out there like Leonardo, who could do a lot of things at once. Every time he took notes, he would, put design into his text. Wagner is someone who, as a composer, also wrote his own libretti. But most of us aren't like that, right? Most of us are good in one thing, and we rely on others to inspire us to do things. And so it's that kind of joint inspiration and that kind of collaboration I'd like to be thinking about today. And not surprisingly, I want to think, my starting point is again going to be language, and it's going to be words, stories, texts, and how they inspire of artistic creation. And even though I've opened with an opening to a film, I'm mainly going to be looking at endings. How do, in the endings of plays, operas, films, whatever, how does that ending become an ending eye, as it were, not just to the audience, which is certainly important, but also, again, to the original genius whose inspiration lay behind that book or that opera or that film with which we emerge. I think we'd agree that the whole point of writing is to share and to get the words out to the world. And so at the end of the day, I'm also suggesting that the three writers with whom these artists are concerning themselves, namely Dante, Tasso, and Pirandello, they might have with the result of what happened. So briefly, as I grab some water, you can have a look at what we're going to be pausing on for the next 40 minutes or so. So even though this is a new thing for me, I also just wanted to start with an area I know a little bit better, and this is where the books of hours in my original title kind of creeps in here. Not a book of hours. This is what's called a breviary, which is a large version of a book of hours. If you know what a book of hours is, you'll know that it was a kind of liturgical shortcut, mainly for people of some means. Elite folk could afford to pay an illuminator to prepare for them a kind of prayer book, which to the liturgies of the liturgical year. The breviary was a much larger, usually folio size version of a book of hours, which was often something funny. And in the case of this example I want to show you very briefly, it's a community of Clarissan nuns who lived in a convent just outside the southernmost gate in Siena in the 1400s. And an artist named Sano di Pietro, who probably well into his 70s, so this would be the 1470s, late 1460s, was asked to create a series of illuminations for this very beautiful, prestigious manuscript, which I actually got about 2 weeks before COVID locked everything down in Italy. It's actually one of those manuscripts that is not typically on show, but I was so annoyingly persistent with the head bibliotecaria that she found. Gave me an afternoon to look at this incredible manuscript, and the minute she brought it to my table, Biblioteca Comunale, the other 10 or so scholars already in that room, it was like a magnet. They all came, they all had to see this manuscript that was so rarely brought out. And it really is a treasure. There's over 100 by Sano and probably other members of his bottega who designed this gorgeous breviary for the 80 or so nuns who lived in this Clarissan convent until it was closed because the Medici were besieging the city in 1555. So we have to imagine this group of nuns who have this incredible visual imagery added to what would be, again, a fairly predictable list of things that you would see in a manuscript. It would start with a calendar with all the feast days. It would move into the Psalms and the books we find in a book of hours. Then it would have other liturgical things for the year, as well as ending with the offices for the dead. So it's a kind of, it takes you from this beautiful calendar, an example from the calendar in a second, and it takes you to the Mass for the dead. And then if you go back to page 1, and as it were, you start all over again. These are all rituals in which the nuns themselves would clearly have been very much involved. And I just want to focus on a couple of these illuminations and to speculate with you as to why did Sano di Pietro choose to do these particular images for these Clarissan nuns in a breviary, which, to put it quickly, is the kind of thing that tells a story. It tells a story about a year, January through December, but it also tells the story of the many, many martyrs and the saints of the church. It tells the story of David's Psalms. It tells the story of all the feast days. And it finally tells the story of life and how those lives are put to a close. So I want to start with this very cool little illumination, which shows you an event that would have been quite recognizable to our Clarissan nuns, even if they didn't have the Latin to be with. And that's the entrance of Clare of Assisi. Luca mentioned I've just translated Dacia Marini's book on Clare of Assisi, which she calls In Praise of Disobedience, which it very much is. This is probably Clare at her most disobedient. Clare is in the blue, has just come in the middle of the night, escorted by 2 of her maids, very wealthy aristocratic family, to join, guess who, Francis of Assisi, in his little hermitage/monastery outside the walls of Assisi. And so this moment, which gets, a fairly large illumination for this page of the text, is exactly the moment that these nuns are constantly thinking about and celebrating. They too have left their homes to go outside the wall into their own convent on the south side of the Romano in Siena. And Clare, of course, is the founding abbess, the founding mother of the order. in which they believe. So, we already have a way that one can say identifies this world of the Clarissan nuns for them in particular. This is a breviary. It knows exactly who its audience is and who is designing the illumination so that themselves can enter this book and find in that book a kind of community. But there's a much more explicit way in which Sano di Pietro is creating this kind of continuity with the text. It's on the very first page that's illuminated. This is January. So this we begin our calendar year, and this is where we begin the entire breviary itself, where we get all, you can't really see it because I've cut off most of the writing, but, we have all the saints' days in January, starting from, January 1st, praising the circumcision of the Lord and going all the way down to January 1st. But look at the illumination that Sano di Pietro has given us, and I've given you an illumination that's a little bit larger so we can see more easily. 3 Clarissan nuns, obviously dressed in the habits which these women would have been wearing. This is a perfect image for today. You look out the window and you see the snow falling. So that, we have this woman here, the nun in the middle, warming her hands by the snow falling outside her window. Here we have a nun. It seems like she's actually looking at the snow outside as she has her spindle, doing something which all Clarissan nuns did, following St. Clare herself. She is the patron saint of embroidery, after all. And this is something all of the nuns in the convent were engaged. And of course, we all love what the third nun on the left is doing. She's pouring wine for them to be drinking with their meal on a tablecloth, which is probably a tablecloth that these nuns themselves have made. So literally, as you enter the right, you open the initial page, which thanks the donor for giving money for this Clarissan book. And right away, you see our 3 nuns at this moment of January, sitting in their warm, cozy little room, looking at the snow, getting ready for dinner, on their embroidery skills, warming their hands. So I think it's a beautiful way that San Pietro creates an entering point for these women. I won't go through all the months, even though they're wonderful to see. He also places the nuns in the month of March. He shows them praying in their little chapel. And in this world, we're beyond the window. We see the outside world, where because March, you have farmers at work already starting the planting. But you also have farmers who have delivered to these nuns praying the fish, because it's Friday and it's Lent. And the nuns need to not eat meat. So this constant engagement with the community, either by illustrations of St. Clare. There are 5 other illustrations of Clare in the manuscript and 11 of St. Francis. Again, this is the community they're part of, as well as moments. And as I already said, the last illustration, and the last thing, this is on page 543, the last kind of ritual that is mentioned in this manuscript is the ritual of death. And the liturgy that would have for masses of the dead and for the wake that preceded the mass. Now, this is, I have to say, I've run this by several scholars of both women's history, who were experts in medieval women. There's a bit of disagreement on whether the two. So we have 3 women who were visibly bright. Their hair is down. They're dressed in black. It's perhaps a fairly prominent male who is lying on the deathbed. We then have someone in purple, perhaps some kind of cleric, who is calming these women down, but also praying with them, obviously either praying or singing. There's 2 figures, obviously in black on the left. It's not clear if they're men or if they can also be the Clarissan nuns. A special liturgical moment, a Mass of the Dead, have able to leave their convent to take part in it. So 2 scholars that have consulted said, absolutely, they're women, and another one has said, there's no way these are women. Look at the masculine features on the face. Happy to talk about this later. But if these are indeed Clarissan nuns on our left, who are praying for the dead in this moment, which brings them together with the secular individuals from Assisi, then it's another way of embedding them, and I mean that word in a very strict sense here, embedding them into the community which they've left, but also embedding them into this book. And if it's not women, if it's male clerics, then it's simply a reminder of what their duties are. They do pray for each other's deaths, but also we're all going to be on that deathbed. This is a breviary which takes us from those lively moments, sitting in front of the fire, warming your hands, working on your embroidery, to finally this inevitable moment of the threshold, death, and how the illustrations take us through this and make the community of readers part of this world is what I'm really intrigued in. As I present to you today thoughts about how the arts are companions of one another. How does Sano bring us into this text without, quote unquote, violating or betraying the content of that text? But I want to use this as a jumping off point to my 3 authors. As I suggested, they're going to be Dante, Tasso and Pirandello. And you can probably guess that Dante is the first one to be thinking about in terms of magic illuminations, not unlike these of Sana di Pietro. In fact, we're going to be turning to his contemporary in Siena, Giovanni di Paolo, to see what Giovanni does with the Commedia. But I want to, by way of just a couple of passages by a wonderful colleague of mine, Bruce Gordon, who's in the Divinity School, whose recent book on the Global Bible, I think very nicely pinpoints what it is that someone like Sana di Pietro, who we've just seen, Giovanni di Paolo, who we'll see in a second, were attempting to do. As he notes, from the century on, the Bible becomes an object of veneration, a physical experience, a holy object. It becomes a translation of human yearning for a text, not just of words, but of transcendent beauty. So, he's interested more in how do we make this text beautiful? That beauty expresses holiness and encounter, a relationship between the beholder and the object that enhances the written word. And I would very much say that even though he's talking about the 5th century, we're looking at the 15th, there are a lot of ways in which we've just seen Sano di Pietro really engaging that written word and enhancing how its audience can be a part of it. And then Bruce goes on. Cultures dominated by spoken words, visual images, and tactile objects, common and elite Christians among representations of the divine in relics, paintings, architecture, and sacraments. The Bible as a book entered into this sacred landscape, taking its place in the sanctuary of the holy, and I would just add, and letting its readers in via their embrace of its visual imagery. And so with this visual imagery in mind, I want to turn to Dante for a few minutes and to what Kenneth Clark, unquestionably the most beautiful illustrated Dante in existence. I'm sure there'll be disagreement about this, but he might be close in this assessment. This is, as I already mentioned, by one of Sano's contemporaries, Giovanni di Paolo, who did this incredibly elaborate illumination of the Paradiso in the 1440s while he was in Siena for none other than Alfonso V of Aragon, who was currently at that point King of Naples, and a supporter of Vienna, this feisty little republic that was always fighting for its independence. And for a while, they had the support of the French, other times support of the Spanish, and at this moment in the 1440s, the support of the King of Naples. Other artists had already done Inferno and the Purgatorio, and it now fell to Giovanni di Paolo to take on the much more difficult task of this ethereal realm of Paradiso. And again, I'm not an art historian here, and I'd welcome your comments, but it's clear that in messing around with Paradiso, there are different ways to do it. If you have in mind, if you've ever seen any of Botticelli's drawings of Paradiso, they're very ethereal, right? I mean, they're in a very light pencil, and we always see Dante and Beatrice and everyone else just simply kind of floating in this ethereal, non-space. This is a space that is incredibly well-defined in Giovanni di Paolo illustrations, and we'll see them a little bit closer up in a second. I just wanted to introduce him to us by way of an illustration from Canto 9, in which we see Beatrice hovering to our left. Inside this sphere of Venus, we have the Cistercian monk Folchetto of Marsiglia, again, in his paradisal realm of Venus, these rays spinning out behind him like a halo, as he's launching this invective into the horrible state of the Catholic Church and the corrupt condition of its popes, its cardinals, its bishops, and its priests. And not incidentally, as I mentioned, this horrible church over which we have a ding is none other than Florence's, at that point, unfinished Duomo. Florence and Siena always being, still today, inveterate enemies of one another. So, here Giovanni di Paolo is getting a little dig in at Siena's historic terms of Tuscan authority. So I think that a wonderfully grounded way to use that word again to bring us into the context for what is otherwise, again, this very ethereal cantica of Dante's point, with Beatrice, as always, hovering to Dante's side. And I think it's important to note that in every single one of the 61 illustrations, Beatrice is always the one further away, and Dante's the one closer to us, right? Literally our mediator between what goes on in paradise and what goes on here on earth for us readers. Dante is always the guy in the middle who's making our own passage between here and there that much easier. We'll see in a slightly better example of an illustration. This is from the canto where I have of course, his ancestor, Cacciaguida, announcing sadly to the pilgrim, I'm Dante, but your fate will be that of exile. And Pope Hennessy puts it, these are panels, these are illustrations full, of movement and continuity. Hennessy goes so far as to say it's a televised version of the poem. And so we're going from one moment to, and here certainly we see things in sequence. Here's Dante being outed from Florence. We see again on the left the unfinished Duomo, so there's no question about what city this is. And outside the gates, in solitude, in anguish, his hand on his mourning what has been this horrible exile from the city that he loves. So again, we have a sense of movement, but also familiarity, right? Paradise, but it's also, and maybe it's really, about what goes on down here. And of course, what's going on down here, at least in Canto 16 and 17, is Dante learning about the future that he is shortly about to face within fewer than 2 years. Another sense of movement and continuity we get in the Sphere of Venus with Justinian, who is explaining the 3 events of redemption. What made Christ possible? We have the fall of Adam and Eve. We move immediately, Annunciation. And then, of course, we have Christ suffering on the cross. And once again, here we have Justinian in his Sphere of Venus and Beatrice and Dante, who were listening. And again, even though Beatrice is hovering above the kind of contaminated of earth that is this former beautiful paradise, Dante's own robe, if not his feet, are actually in contact with these green hills. So Dante, again, our mediator, who embodies both heaven and earth, right? Who's both on this, but who's also there. Beatrice, much more ethereal, is always above him and much further from us, right? We don't have access to her, but Dante does, and thus we're dependent on what he says to us in the words that we would have found right above this particular illumination. So throughout the manuscript, I would say that Giovanni urges us to see not only what and especially who is in paradise is back on earth, that our paradisal companions are constantly referring us to. They're never too far away from that place where we as readers and viewers are grounded. We're here, perhaps like Giovanni di Paolo, only kilometers away from that cursed dome of Florence, that dome that didn't yet exist, and the protagonist Dante hovering alongside Beatrice. So just as Dante is shown here, along with the Adam and Eve already moving into exile, the kneeling angel and the Christ with blood falling from his wounds, these illustrations are, again, they're full of it, right? In some cases, they're even a kind of dance. And indeed, as Kate Maxwell, a wonderful medieval scholar, has put it, the manuscript page is a site of performance. It enacts for us an event, or to cite Pope Hennessy again, we not only see the record of a journey through space and time and spiritual growth. And it's on the performative that I really want to be focusing the rest of my remarks, especially sound and movement. But I want to close these altogether 2 brief thoughts on Dante by going to the very last canto, which actually has 2 illustrations. And this is the one with which we open, which is at the very bottom of the page, which entire prayer of St. Bernard to Mary. In this illustration, we have what seems like a pretty conventional image of Mary as a Madonna, right? Mary as mother, recognizable from hundreds, if not thousands, of paintings with her and the babe on her lap. She's sitting in a very humble kind of wooden chair. We're going to see in a second a very different illustration about Canto 33. This first page, again, like I said, gives us the entirety of Benedict's prayer. It ends with allusion to a Beatrice, who, of course, at this point is no longer serving as Dante's guide. Our guide now is Bernard. Again, he's further away from us as readers, and Dante is the closer one. But she's nonetheless invoked in the last words of Benedict's prayer to the Madonna, Vinca tua grazia I movimenti umani, vedi Beatrice. And he's talking to the Madonna here, right? Vedi Beatrice, Beatrice over there. Con quanti beati per li miei preghi ti chiudono le mani, right? May your protection of his mortal passions. See Beatrice, how many saints are with her? They join my prayers. They clasp their hands to you, right? And we end the prayer, and then we have this illustration. So again, pretty conventional, shouldn't be that much of a surprise in terms of what we're seeing at the bottom of Bernard's prayer. But this allusion to the conquering of movimenti umani, right? Human passions, human movements, quite literally, is nonetheless itself kind of conquered in the final illustration to Canto 33, and the final illustration, of course, to the entire manuscript, to the Commedia. It's an interesting illustration. I'm sure, again, those of you who have Canto 33, in mind, it's maybe not terribly surprising. It moves us to a very different and slightly later movement in Paradiso 33. This is the allusion to a Neptune, rises up from the ocean, finding himself struck with admiration, shadow of the ship of the Argonauts, except, as you know, if you've read Paradiso, Neptune's not on top of the ocean, he's down deep, and looking up, he sees the shadow of, and that's all. Giovanni di Paolo gives us a Neptune who is actually merged, and who does see perhaps a shadow. You can see the shadow that the boat is actually casting. But more importantly, he gives us Beatrice back. Beatrice is present while Neptune is Dante-like rising from the waters. And he also gives us a Madonna who is not quietly sitting on her throne with her baby, listening to the prayer of Saint Bernard, but an assumed Mary, a Mary in the midst of her assumption, rising up, obviously, from this contaminated sea and this contaminated earth to the place where she supposedly is not yet, which of course is in heaven. And I'll also add, if you look at her in the example where we have her a little bit larger, she's breaking the frame, a frame which Pope Hennessy calls in his discussion of all of these illuminations in the Paradiso, solid and immutable, right? He goes on to say, things that go on, change, they're moving around, they're continuously in motion. Is, again, a cinematic version or a television version of the Paradiso. But the frames themselves are immutable. And here we have an instance where the halo is 1, 2, 3 layers of this frame. And one thinks, as she continues to be assumed, will she go outside of the frame altogether and explode into the text itself, which at this point has effectively ended. So this wonderful sense, I think, that Giovanni is impressing on us, again, of movement, of rethinking a constituency of this final words of the Paradiso, bringing Beatrice back, as our guide, bringing Neptune up from the sea, and putting Mary not as a passive listener to Bernard's prayer, but as this figure who is boldly, as it were, going beyond all frames imaginable to attain her own space in heaven. It's a very different and edgy and I don't missionary, but certainly intriguing way to be thinking about the end of the Commedia. Granted, as from the lines at the end of the Commedia, or almost at the end of the Commedia, Dante himself is exploding, as it were, as he's talking about this perno that is legato con amore in un volume. And this is a volume which on earth itself is constantly dissipated and constantly, si squaderna, as we know. The pages are diffused. We never see it in one place, but here place. For Giovanni di Paolo to make that one place the assumed Mary herself, interesting theological and certainly artistic interpretation of this particular moment that, again, I would love to talk about at the end. With that said, go with this idea of breaking the frame by a Dante accompanied by Beatrice, watching a assumed Mary and even a Neptune dragged all the way from the bottom of the sea to see this as well, to move on to what different kind of artistic experience, let's say. And that's the experience of Claudio Monteverdi, and especially his fascinating and very creative rendition of 16 ottave from Tasso, La Liberata. I want to get to Monteverdi by way, though, of something else he wrote about 14 years earlier than the Combattimento. He did the Combattimento in 1620. His Orfeo is from 1607. And I wanted to say that, like our crow in Caos, in the Pirandello, in the Taviani film of Pirandello's Novelle, we have a musical accompaniment. And this is actually La Musica herself who joins us, the very opening of Monteverdi's Orfeo, who says, io la musica son, introducing herself at the beginning of this opera about Orpheus to the audience. We then get other companions who join Orpheus the way. Speranza is someone that he meets, and he calls her compagna e duce. When he meets Speranza, of course, Speranza has to leave because, as we all know, Speranza can't enter the gates of hell, as we know from Dante's Inferno. And then further down, Orfeo addresses his harp as mia cetra onnipotente. She is the figure, this cetra or this harp, who allows him to go down and to find and to redeem and to restore his beloved, although we all know this is not as it ends happily. Just to say that Monteverdi, early on, as he's working on an edgy new genre called opera, is very explicit about music's role. She is our companion throughout that entire opera. And in fact, the music, if there was more time, I would go prologo from the Orfeo. The music that joins her as she shows up then comes back as Orpheus descends into the underworld. So we know that she's with us constantly, even if at the end of the day, he doesn't bring Eurydice back. But I'm not here to talk so much about the Orfeo as to talk about Tasso. And I'll drink some more water and feel free to dig into these quotes about what Tasso thought about sound. Tasso thought of Orfeo as the consummate, as he was, right, mythologically speaking, the consummate poet, right, the person who spoke and his words were already in music. And he lists a few on this mythical moment, like Linus, Olympus, et cetera, who were also able to utter words that were always automatically translated into musical accompaniment and musical performance. But as he goes on to say, but we've, right, human imperfection has interfered with the original beautiful mythological moment where music and language were always a thing. How do we get that back? So Homer for him becomes not to Orpheus, but through his epic poetry, a figure who's at least able to bring sound into description of various things. He imitated the voices, right? And I love the word voce here. Of fiumi, selve, dei venti, del fuoco, del mare, metalli, le pietre, le fiere, gli uccelli, et cetera, right? We can hear these sounds as we're reading the Iliad and the Odyssey. Virgil was the next great imitator of Homer and was also able to reproduce sonically things in a way that puts them le pone innanzi agli occhi. We can literally see these things, but not only can we see them, and Tasso Tasso then goes in to say, reading Virgil, we hear of the waves, the howling of the winds, the crashing of rocks. When soldiers go to battle in Virgil, how is it possible not to hear il bombo dell'arme, right? The clashing of arms, or more metaphorically, the run of war. We literally get to hear their sounds because her descriptions are they're sonic, right? They take over. They have what Tasso calls energia. They have this kind of energy that translates the words off the page visually into the ear and into sound. So I think we could say that Tasso's ideal epic is not so much a landscape as a soundscape. Just a quick quote here in English by one of his big critics from the Accademia della Crusca, Riccardo Salviati. It's like, Tasso, your poem is so difficult to understand that no one can understand it when listening to it. You have to read it, looking at it. You cannot hear this thing. It doesn't speak to me as a language that has any whatsoever on my ear because it's too damn difficult, right? Tasso, on the other hand, really protested what he calls the over-dolcezza of Tuscan. So a known resistor of the language of Tuscan that, of course, the Accademia della Crusca was supporting and perpetrating. So in this little dilemma, 1580s, goes into the 1590s when Tasso does revise quite a bit his Gerusalemme Liberata, more legibile, more readable as a conquistata. I want to bring Claudio Monteverdi, the great composer of the first half of the 17th century. He was drawn to Tasso over his entire career. He put a number of his rime into music, but no more extensively engaged with Tasso than his account of the furor, or the fury, of two dedicated warriors, one male, one female, one Christian, one Muslim. So from Canto 12 of the Gerusalemme Liberata, that happens in utter darkness. It happened in the middle of the night outside the walls of Jerusalem, and thus it depends very much on sound. Indeed, even as Tasso felt that there was utter incommensurability between music and that of his own time, it's also the case that Tasso spent a lot of time thinking about how his own language suited to a musica antica that he could only imagine as sublime, and that he, as a writer, as a poet, had to push beyond of language to try to get to something more forte, more, in his own way, more powerful, possessed of more energia, to use the word he uses of Virgil and of Homer. So this is the challenge that Monteverdi takes, to grasp the sound inherent in an episode that's one of the most memorable of the Gerusalemme Liberata. The midst of a dark night outside Jerusalem's walls, we have Clorinda, the Muslim warrior who's dressed in an armor not her own, takes on in battle the Christian knight who, of course, has long loved her, Tancredi, only to be mortally wounded by her. And her last wish is that he baptize her and hence fulfill what she has only recently learned was her own Christian initial identity when she was born. He fulfills that identity, she is baptized, and she dies with her final word being pace. Horrified by what he's done, if you've read the Liberata, you well know, Tancredi, wishes to do nothing, less than kill himself right on the spot, something that he's been yearning for and loving for, these many years. But he's persuaded by his comrades to continue to fight on behalf of the Christians and to liberate the city of Jerusalem. Because this all happens at nightfall, and I will just give you octave, which kind of make this quite clear, especially the very first one here. Tasso's narrator, who does not intervene often in the text, as you know, his narrator is not Ariosto's narrator, who's always bringing himself in the beginning and the end of each canto and often in the middle. In a fairly rare moment, has his own narrator speaking to the notte, to the night, asking that night who within her deep dark breast conceal in oblivion this fatto si grande, degno di un pieno teatro, right? This great feat, which is the duel between Clorinda and Verdi, that, may it please night so he can bring this event forth and in the open to future ages reveal and proclaim. This prayer to the notte, this invocation to notte, just letting us know in a world not of sight, but of sound. And the sound then, if we look down at the other ottava, 55, we hear the swords clashing horribly. Odi le spade, orribilmente urtarsi a mil ferro, il piede dorme non parte. Odi le spade, as we'll hear in a second. Monteverdi has this phrase repeated several times. Odi le spade, right? We're going to be literally hearing that from the language itself. But again, ears are all we have in this context because see anything. As he calls to the night, please, let me move forward with a story that I can't see the events. I can only hear it. And so he's trying to literally reproduce the sound that we would have heard in the middle of the night. And I'll get to this moment in the opera in a second, if we call it an opera. You may protest that genre, and it's not clear that it's really an opera. But just a tiny bit of context for it. It was first performed in the Palazzo Nigo in Venice for Carnival in 1624. This is the same Venice where the Orfeo had been performed 16 years earlier. Again, not quite very short. It's about 24, 25 minutes long. It's something of a hybrid, that's singing and dance, and mainly sung by the figure called the testo, or the text, who Monteverdi clearly is thinking of himself, who is the figure in white, who to a certain extent, like us, watching these two figures who are spending most of these 16 ottave that are sung, largely by the testo, in combat. Just like Dante is our mediator or our narrator in the Commedia, so does the testo here become literalized as that mediator. And although this won't be the case in the little excerpt that I'm going to be showing you from from a Dutch presentation, Combattimento, I wanted to show you this particular picture because it really does position the testo mediator. He's the one who's closest to us. And in most performances of the Combattimento that I've seen, that is exactly the case. He's in front of us, and then we're kind of watching from afar because it's usually performed in the dark. We're hearing the sounds of these clashing of weapons, and only rarely really getting to see our two warriors. The figure we do see who's in full light is the testo in Monteverdi's rendition of the Combattimento. Again, it was performed during Carnival, and I love this suggestion of Antonio Cascio that it's a private staging of Carnival within Carnival season. So we're seeing a kind of carnival. He even talks about it as a kind of street, not unlike something we might have found in the streets of Venice, two people kind of getting into it, or maybe it's, they're doing a little thing about the vices, right? Good versus evil. That's going to be one of the street performances that is just going to be happening during Carnevali in Venice. But it's a highly problematic representation of what in the street is a much more straight contest of virtue versus vice, i.e. the Muslim woman warrior versus the Christian knight. This lack of straightforwardness is in part because of Clorinda's baptism at the performance, but there's more to it than that, which is based in no small part on Monte's additions. And to understand those additions, we'll get to this in a second, I just want to point out one of the very small little changes he makes, but when we hear the in a second, I think you'll see why he made that change. The Drusalena Liberata itself says here, this is a few ottave after the one I just read, they're going back to the sword, e l'altro il tinge con molte piaghe, is what Tasso said. But it just changes this ever so slightly. Torno al ferro, this is after they've taken a little break, e l'altro il tinge di molto sangue. And I want you to be listening for that word sangue in the section we're going to be hearing in a second, because con molte piaghe, all right, the wounds, and in fact, Tasso will be using the word sangue several times later, so you can say that Tasso is going to overdo this word. Monteverdi is going to overdo this word. And when we get to this idea, they go back to fighting, and both of their swords are getting tainted with a great deal of blood. When he hits the word sangue, listen to see what happens in the example I'm now going to be playing for you. So I'm going to play you two little examples really quickly. One goes back to the moment that I showed you a second ago, the swords clashing. We're going to hear, this idea of sound, what those swords clashing really are doing. So we're listening to the Odi le Spade section. And then I'll just move forward a little bit, the section where, tornano al ferro, what is called the stile concitato, or the very agitated style. And then we hit this word molto sangue. And then just expense when we get to that word. So let's give this a shot. As I said earlier, I've never really done clips before in a PowerPoint, but hopefully I'll figure out where exactly to start this and then where to stop it. So again, two very brief excerpts here. Let's try to nail it. Okay, here we go. Odi le Spade. This is not my favorite version of this, but I like the fact that I see the Italian as you're watching the performance. Okay, I'll leave you with that. I'm going to jump ahead ever so slightly to the moment right before the sangue shows up. So we get more of the stile concitato, and then we're going to arrive at something else. See how this is slowing down? Go from a major to a minor key, trying to breathe. So hopefully you could hear the shift, right? I mean, we get to the word sangue, con molto sangue, and everything changes, and everything's going to be downhill for Clorinda from here. And if we think about the sangue, of course, there's the sangue of the fighting, and both of them are bloody. It's not just her at this point, it's both of them. But we have to remember she's a resolute virgin, right, who has always resisted Tancredi's timid advances, and who is like the kind of Diana figure, or the Camilla figure, for Virgil's Aeneid, right? She wants nothing to do with men, and she could care less about Tancredi. But the molto sangue here, I think, is also Monteverdi's not so implicit suggestion that we think about this penetration of the sword as also an act of penetration, right? She's no longer the virgin. And the molto sangue that he's introducing into this text, where that's not the phrase, just becomes a way of showing the extent to which we're seeing not just the death of her material body, but the death of a paradigm of resistance within the Liberata herself, right? Someone who's defied both Christianity and men. And she's only recently learned that her family heritage, in fact, is Christianity. So to this extent, as I'll turn to my final example in the Combattimento, as to where finally Clorinda is using her own voice. We've heard her singing before, again, always in this stile concitato, right, the kind of agitated, exciting, clashing of weapon style. Something very different will happen now in the last examples that I want to give you. So the first one is, having been addressed throughout as nemici, right? These are the T's, they are fighting each other, they will never be joined in love, unless we have the violence here of what, again, Monteverdi, and I think even Tasso referred to as a kind of sexual violation, a sexual penetration. There's the moment where there's been so much sangue, troppo sangue, that Clorinda finally takes the stage, center stage, as it were. And after, again, 2 or 3 references to the nemico, now calls him amico. Amico, hai vinto. Io ti perdono. Perdona tu ancora. Al corpo no che nulla pave, all'alma sì. Dei per lei prega e dona battesimo a me, che ogni mia colpa lave. Play this, and I'll ask you, as I said, just listen to where the 2 end rhymes, pre and lave, are ending in terms of notes. Again, the stile concitato is now in the past, this agitated style. We now have, what is that difference? And right after this, I'll play for your last words, which open up yet another kind of disorienting realm musically in this text. So back to our combattimento. I will try to get you the right exact in the text here, where she calls him her new amico. And then from there, we'll go to her very last line. So. A last major moment, moving into a major quite briefly. I'll take you to one other moment by way of a shorter passage at the very top of the slide, her words. And I want to just focus on those first 2 words, dir parea. In Tao, as Clorinda has been baptized now, Tancredi, can't believe he just took her helmet off and found it was her. I vista o conoscenza, this incredibly dramatic moment. It's his beloved. He nonetheless baptizes her anyway. He obviously is on her last moments here. And as he's looking at his beloved in her last moments, she seemed to say, S'apri il cielo, io vado in pace. Heaven opens, I go in peace. What does Monteverdi do to this moment? In the last passage from the Combattimento, I'm going to now show you. Parea, and appear to her. Appear to whom? Appears to Tancredi, right? Even though Tancredi doesn't say this, it's the testo or the narrator who's saying this. It appeared to Tancredi that she seemed to say, heaven opens. So what does Monteverdi do with this very subjective moment in terms of, might even be called Tancredi's wish fulfillment? I think it worked. I think I baptized her. I think she's going to heaven. So let's see, how does Monteverdi deal with this? And I'll take you to the last powerful ending of the if I can hit it. Okay, here we go. So he's just seen it's her. He just realized it, Clorinda. He didn't die yet, but he wants to die soon. So what does this do? By no longer being in Tancredi's head, but hearing the words uttered by Clorinda herself. And I have to say, I say herself, we don't know actually if the performer would have been a male or female in the Carnevale in Venice in the Mocenigo Palace in 1624. This is still very much open to debate and discussion. Nonetheless, Clorinda closes this down. Tasso goes on to spend ottave and ottave on Tancredi's grief and his melancholy and his suicidal impulse, and is being talked out of that suicidal impulse by his colleagues. We don't have any of that here. Monteverdi cuts us off here with a line that was not Clorinda's day in the Gerusalemme Liberata. To go back to my breaking the frame, it's a moment where Clorinda herself is quite literally breaking the frame. She breaks it in terms of the key she introduces into the final. Going into the key of D major as opposed to A, which is what we've been in for most of the combattimento. And also just in terms of the timing or the temporality of these last measures. I don't know if you can all see this, but, where that Monteverdi published 14 years later in his 8th book of Madrigali, the Ottavo Libro, the measure where these lines are being uttered, again, not by Clorinda in Tasso, but certainly by Clorinda or Monteverdi. This is an open that goes beyond the metrical structure of all the other measures preceding it. And in fact, because the orchestration at this point is so light in comparison to where it has been elsewhere in the score, just this kind of unaccompanied strings. We have a valuable suggestion by the wonderful musicologist Matteo Resi that Verdi knew that only through the performance, that is the individual embodiment of his music by a singer, her individually felt affection, could the desired active effect be achieved. He therefore left the decision about tempo and rhythmic relation and metrics up to the artist who played Clorinda. So you could say Monteverdi literally left the frame open. This is a moment for whoever is performer, female, as they may have been, to break through the frame of the opera, to break through the frame of the measure, and do with it what he or she wanted. So, and ending again on this wonderful high-pitched D, which opens us up into in major and rather than a minor key, leaving Tancredi far behind. We're not thinking twice about Tancredi, also because it ends there, but also the testo himself, right, our narrator, is no longer our mediator, but we're exposed, as it were, quite intimately and quite explicitly to the voice of Clorinda herself. So this body that's released, a body that breaks through its bondage. I know this is quite a bit of a stretch, and I also know I'm going on now for far too long. But I'd just like to say it takes us back in Pirandello's cows. A crow released from bondage, a crow released into the sky. And this crow, for those of you who haven't seen the movie, which looks like many of you, I'll just add that the crow is the binding musical force in the Taviani's film. Pirandello wrote his novelle per un anno. Obviously, like Petrarch, going to do 366 novelle per un anno. He wrote about 200, so he never got around to doing, a novella for every day. That this was not a project that he ever finished, nor was it a project for which he does Boccaccio and the Decameron, a kind of cornice, right? He doesn't have a frame for these novellae. Many of them are about bourgeois life in Rome. Some are about Sicily. And again, 5 of the Sicilian novellae are what the Taviani brothers chose to focus on in their film. And they focus on them in the film using the crow as our framing device, right? The crow is the figure who he unites all the stories. We get to the first story, L'Altro Figlio, we go to the second story, and the crow is our kind of in-between figure. And it's not just the image of the crow, it's the of the crow that we heard a little while ago. You're going to think, 5 hours ago when I started talking, when we heard that kind of, wonderful, edgy, minor key music dominated the crow's flight. I want to take us back to the Taviani, and I promise I'll do more briefly than I had intended, to the way that the Taviani end this film. They do not have the crow taking us to final novella, which is called the kind of epilogo, right? The epilogue. It's very short, as opposed to the other stories that we get in the film. And it's called the colloquio coi personaggi due. It is a colloquio, a conversation with Pirandello's deceased mother. And what's interesting about the dates here is that this novella published in September 1915. I think it was on September 9th, either September 11th. Yeah, September 11th, 1915. His mother had passed away in Sicily 2 days earlier. He wasn't there. So within these 48 hours, Pirandello writes this, to me, lost a mother, a very moving and very powerful story about losing someone who you're not with at the hour of their departure, someone extremely dear to you, in this case, Ricci Granito, again, who dies in Sicily. He's in Rome. And 2 days later, he is having his colloquio coi personaggi, which is the first part of this colloquio, which had been published a month earlier in the same magazine, Due was published. And if you all know Sei personaggi in cerca di un autore, this novella written in 1915 was the basis for that very, very famous, well-known play, probably the best-known play of Pirandello's. 6 characters and someone who will tell their stories. So it's about bussare alla porta, right, on the door, and trying to find the artist who will listen to them, and who will listen to them enough to give their story time on a stage, as it turns out. So we have the kind of this story in the first colloquio with personaggi who knock on his door on a Sunday, and somehow, it's 4 o'clock now, you got to leave, he throws them out. But the next day, there's someone in the room, he can't make out who it is. He sees ombra, and then he's like, Mama, come tu qui? It turns out, indeed, in the novella, this is his mother, and she has come to Rome. As she puts it, voluto venire per dirmi quello che non potei per tenanza prima di staccarsi dalla vita. There's something she wanted to tell him, but she couldn't because he was far away. She was dying in Sicily. He was in Rome. So here she is in Rome as the ombra, as the ghost who is telling him. We then get ellipses, about a 2-page, very short, compressed version of her autobiografia, her life. As a young girl in Sicily, forced into exile when her father protested the Bourbons in 1848. They went to Malta, came back to Sicily after her father died, her marriage, her children, and now we're in the middle of World War I, which time Pirandello's own son has been a captive, which Pirandello is totally, understandably, very obsessed about. He would remain a prisoner of war for exactly 2 years and then back. And then the very last line is the one that you have on the bottom. After her autobiografia, he tells her how sad he is that she has died because he is no longer alive for her. And there's a clearance, he can't tell where she's gone, but then sento dentro, ma come lontano, la sua voce che mi sospira. And here's what it is she came to tell him. Guarda le cose anche con gli occhi di quelli che non le vedono più. See things with the eyes of those who can no longer see them. It will give you a sense of bitterness, of remorse, but it will also render those things, more beautiful and more sacred. And the novella ends. And, again, sento lontano, dentro himself, dentro the camera, right? We don't know. Is she still there? Is she still there? So it's this amazing, quite beautiful story about a man coming to terms with his grief, or beginning to come to terms with his grief, by way of a mother who him. This is the novella that the Taviani use as their final, as their epilogue, as they're taking leave, as they're saying goodbye in the film. If we had more time, I would have shown you the scene where the mother comes to him in his house. And she says right up front the line that I just quoted, see things with the eyes of those who are no longer here. It's no longer the kind of climax or culmination of her visit. Something else is that climax. And I'm going to show you what that climax is. No, I'm not going to do it here. This is him going to his house, but just rent the film. It's on Canopy. You can see it another time. Just rent the film. It's on Canopy. You can see it another time. I want to go to the next slide somehow. Sorry, I just got to get out of the frame. But then I might have to ask for help here. Oh, here we go. I'm sorry. Got it. Okay. So the film. Some of you might know the film takes off from an episode which is only alluded to, as Daniela Bini says, in the ellipses, the puntini, a kind of pausa that the Taviani take full. Here we have the mother in her colloquio in the text. So again, I'm just quoting the novella, saying when I was 13, with my siblings, my mother, my father went into exile. And so we all went on to grossa barca da pesca, una tartana verso l'ignoto. Her father already exiled in Malta. So we get the ellipses, the puntini. Ma l'isola di Goggio prima, puntini, qua, puntini, belle, con quel golfo grande di un azzurro aspro, lucidi, et cetera, right? We get the journey. The Taviani, as Daniela Bini says here, this narrative pause that you make, this is what opens up to the Taviani, the moment that they're going to show us, the moment they're going to focus on, from this long autobiografia that the mother of Pirandello gives us in the novella. So we don't get all the other stuff about the revolution, we don't get all of that stuff, but we do get what happens in between leaving Sicily, the Isola di Goggio, puntini, puntini, poi Malta. It's in those puntini that the scene I do want to show you now transpires. Just jump a little bit ahead. They're taking a little break on this island of the mother wants to rest. The kids want to swim. I'm going to rush through this more wanted to. The mother's like, no, 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 no. You know, there's sharks. And the sailor says, no, no, senor, there are no sharks this time of year. They can go in. The kids are like, Mom, please, can we swim? She's like, okay. But the mother of Pirandello has stayed with her mother, you know, so her mother is like sleeping on her lap or resting on her lap. But she's sadly watching her siblings, you know, take off their clothes, you know, start running up the hill. She's lying there, wishing she could go too. And now you can watch the rest. So the mother of Pirandello is the young girl. That's the sailor telling them, put pumice on you and then go. Where have you heard the music before? The Corvo. So Corvo music is back. She's been released, like the Corvo, to go ascend the mountain. The music's going to change. Anyone know what that song is? Recognize it? Sorry, I didn't want to do that. Le Notte di Figaro. Act 4, Le Notte di Figaro, this servant, Barbarina, she's maybe 12, 13 years old. She's, you know, as soon as Act 4 begins, it's night, back in a nighttime scene. No one can see anything. And she's distraught in the garden of the villa, the domicile of the count, this corrupt count who's been trying to sleep with every woman, you know, he can, perhaps including the young, very young girl Barbarina, and she's lost something. So she just, you know, l'ho perduta me meschina, ah chissà dove sarà. We've just heard those words in what we heard in Taviani. They cut off her because that's where the soundtrack ends, and then they're back on the boat. The song, which is very short, it's less than 2 minutes. Non la trovo e mia cugina, il padron, cosa dirà? We don't know what she's lost, Barbarina. It turns out she's lost a little pin that the count has asked her to give to another woman he's trying to make advances on, Susanna. Long story short, it's the song about and by a young, innocent girl. We don't know what she's lost. We'll soon find that out. And the Figaro, the guy in Lotte di Figaro, will show up and say, just here's another pin. Just give this one. He'll never know the difference. And of course he doesn't. So the tragedy is averted. But what's striking is that it's the only song from what I would call elite culture in the Taviani's film, like from the Crow music to the Mozart music. Also the only song in the entire opera, Le Nozze di Figaro, in a minor key, F minor, which for Mozart was a particularly tragic key. again, I don't want to hold you much longer than I have. It's already been much too long already. I don't know what to make of this juxtaposition of a crow music that's taken us through the entire movie in terms of, what it means in terms of release, right? We go back to the last sentence in the novella that Pirandello had written originally, right? This is a, libero e beato, this crow who has access to sight and access to sound, the kind of ideal cinematic experience we get to see. And as the crow music opens up again in the sequence you just saw, it starts, she too is released from having to be with her mother. She's released to the freedom of this hill of pumice. She gets to the top, and then she's at the top, she's starting to fly down, and the Taviani actually call it a kind of volo, or flight, or even dive. That's when this music from Mozart kicks in, and I don't know what to do with it. What I can tell you are two more things, and then I want to give you a little time for questions, is that after the sequence, they go back on the boat, and then they're on the boat, and it fades, and we're left with this image. This is how the movie ends, with this image of Pirandello alone in the room. His mother's gone. She was sitting on that couch next to him, and now she's there. The only shadow we see is his, obviously not the shadow of his mother. And obviously the Mozart music is over, and we get the crow music coming back as he's sitting here, alone, pensive, depressed, lost. A big difference, which I haven't mentioned yet, is that if in the original novella, Pirandello's mother comes to find him in Rome, the Taviani have him going to Sicily. Not so much to find the mother. He's not sure where. When he goes into his house, he's like, someone told me to come here, but I don't know who. So turn things around in a quite interesting way. And again, I think this might impact on why Mozart, what's been lost? Because the Mozart song is a song about loss, right? L'ho perduta mia meschina, right? I lost it. I can't find it. Who knows where it will be? What will I say to my cousin in my public account? What will become of me, right? What will become of him here at this moment in the film, and why did the Taviani make this juxtaposition? Trading Rome for Sicily on the one hand, and then bringing in our crow music to for less than a minute with Mozart. So I leave us with this question, and perhaps to prompt our thinking about it, I'll just show you what the top say about Mozart. They don't really explain it, but they say something really interesting. I hope that this will lead us to something of a conclusion. So that sequence on the pumice had only, un solo ciak, only one take, perché poi il mare diventò cattivo e dovemmo la isola. So, they're actually talking about the filmatic experience, and they actually filmed it on Lipari. So it wouldn't have been near Malta. It would have been, obviously, very part of Sicily. We were so upset, we said to ourselves, sarà venuta male, girammo con l'obiettivo, right, 18mm lens. They had wanted to do it with other size lenses as well. Ancora ci chiediamo come sarebbe venuta. And then we get this mysterious sentence, ma poi è arrivato Mozart e con semplicità il miracolo del volo si è avverato. So this Mozart somehow, what's being said here, right? I mean, is what they're saying is that sound takes over image. People aren't going to care how murky, they're just going to be overwhelmed by this sound. Why that sound in particular? I guess a question that continues to haunt me. One thing I think that I find especially just thought-provoking is that Barbarina in the opera of Mozart, what she fears is her utter lack of control. I can't find it. What to say? My cugino and the horrible Conte who keeps trying to seduce me. When she's going down that hill, on the other hand, in the Taviani film, what she's embraced is her lack of control. There's a kind of embrace here of, this freedom that I don't have any control over it, but it's only for an instant. And then they're back on the boat and they're forced into exile. So I think what's suggestive to me about the Taviani's quote here is that they're also saying, we lost control, right? We were going to be there all day. In fact, three of the 5 of the kids on the mountain are their own children. So this is and their dog Bella. So this is a family thing here. They had big plans. Let's have a picnic, right? Let's stay all day. But the mare, diventò mosso. They had to leave. And so they too lost control in this instance, right? They had to look for some kind of miracolo that would let them. Again, I'm still mulling over a lot of things with this film, and you're probably wondering, what does any of this have to do with the stuff she was saying before? But I do just want to close by suggesting that this idea of chaos, right, the original name of the Greek name of the Pirandello himself was born, Girgenti, which then became Agrigento. Intricato bosco, right? That's what chaos means, right? From in the dialect and from the original Greek. It's a kind of solo oscura. It's kind of the night in which Dante and are fighting. We can't see anything. It's chaotic. It's the garden where Barbarina loses Lila, right? The pin. Here's my question, and this I hope is something by way of conclusion. Is that Bosco also the text of the original author? And are our accompanying artists, Giovanni Di Paolo, Monteverdi, the Tavianis, and I never mentioned the composer of the score, who's incredible, Nicola Piovani, are they similarly released from the intricato of the constraints of fidelity to their respective testo? Is that the Bosco they're trying to get out of? And my wonderful colleague Penny Marcus, in her terrific book on adaptation from 1992, has a wonderful section on this film, and especially on this. And her thinking about this is that the Taviani's, again, the quote, aspires to the condition of poetry as it seeks freedom from the constraints of prose narration and from the textual memory of Pirandello. And an interesting way to be thinking about this, that the adapters, whether they're musicians, composers, cinematographers, illustrators, they want to be free to bring their own creativity to this project. And the way that Penny puts it, Pirandello is a textual memory to be left behind. But I with all due respect to Penny, I want to go back to our brooding Pirandello at the close to perhaps make some connections between him and Monteverdi and Dante, simply by way of saying that Pirandello was incredibly in the world beyond texts, as I'm sure many of you know. In his book, or his article called Cinema After Pirandello, Robert Gordon reminds us that once, silent film, of course, is around in the early 20s. The soundtrack is only developed in 1928. And in 1928, Pirandello, with what Robert Gordon has called the revolutionary oceanic idea, think about oceans and what we just saw in Taviani, oceanic idea of film, which merges the sense of sound into, and this is a neologism on Pirandello's part, cinemelografia, right? Which Pirandello then goes on to define as the linguaggio visibile della musica. This, for Pirandello, is the great revolution that has been created thanks to the track. He was vastly interested in cinema, just as he was interested in theater. He was interested in dialect, in sounds. In fact, he wrote his thesis in Germany on the suoni e sviluppi of Agrigento, right? The sounds of Agrigento, something that fascinated him during his whole life. And in fact, when he died in 1936, he had developed a very bad cold while he was on set for a cinematic version of probably his best-known novel, Il fu Mattia Pascal. And he passed away from pneumonia a couple of years, precisely when he should have gone to Hollywood to have filmed Se personaggi in Certatore. So just to say that Pirandello was an incredible experimentalist, interested in many different media. And I think, yes, maybe the top shelves need to break free from the textual memory of Pirandello, but would Pirandello have less film? And I wonder to what extent the Taviani's version of the novelle are a kind of gift to Pirandello, saying, here's a film you might have made. Here's a film that you made, except you got pneumonia filming Il fu Mattia Pascal, and you couldn't go to Hollywood to film Personaggi. Here's our gift to you as the film of the Sicily whose sounds you did spend your whole life thinking about and wanted to integrate into this incredible lingua della musica. And I wonder if in the same way, a Tasso, moody concreti, but also experimental, as of course was Dante, would have also given their blessing to what we've seen of Giovanni Di Paolo and Monteverdi as well. So I do have gone over, like I said, I never factored in how long clips would take, not simply, but to find. But thanks for your patience. And if you've got any questions, I'd love to hear them.
Well, thanks for very wide-ranging.
Too wide-ranging. I apologize.
Very, showing a remarkable mastery of various media, various moments in Italian history. I think I might have just to ask you a question. I think I have to study.
Please.
In a few months. So, but maybe somebody who knows more about this thing than I do. Right?
No, I'm the amateur in the room. I promise. My only claim to fame in any of the arts is I played piano since I was 4. That's it. So otherwise, it's all new to me. And I realize, I think when you come to things as an amateur, you probably tend to what's a good word here? They can seem more utopian, no doubt, than they are hardcore film critics and art critics and musicologists. But I think that for me, the kind of breathtaking moment that we saw in the last part of the film of the Taviani, they call it a miracolo, and maybe it is, especially when you know the conditions for filming that, and they're having to abandon the island and look to some kind of rescue and release. It's just really interesting to think about how they did that, and convinced us all to agree with them. So.
First of all, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful journey. So I wanted to ask you something about essentially the difference between. I think I see a difference between the Dante manuscript by Giovanni Paolo and the rest of the case study you presented, in the sense that from the Verdi, like that sangue moment was really wonderful in that it showed really a dramatic shift, right? And in the clip, like in the movie, you could see like the moment of the shift, like cinematically. I don't know, I'm an amateur myself, but there was a moment in which the camera itself kind of like gave a sense of vertigo in the moment in which the girl like realizes that they like will jump and to fly to a sense like the girls, right? And so part of me thinks like, again, all of these sort of like betrayal, like thinking about the metaphysics of mixing up different arts, like again, it's rendered through vertigo, and that like has me thinking about Dante to a certain extent, because he's a poet that so like conceptualizes vertigo in Paradiso especially, right? And so that creates, I think, a great conundrum for an artist, because like you already have it laid out, you already have someone who through words has attempted to break as many as possible, right? And so part of me thinks like, how can we conceptualize again that attempt to work on a text that is so wildly complex in making that attempt totally compared to the rest of the of the base text that we already have? Because I mean, Tasso thinks about sound, yes, but I mean, Dante kind of like does this like in a metaphysical way, right? And so like it's kind of like an impossible task. That manuscript is so mind-boggling to a certain extent, right? And so part of me thinks like, is there vertigo in those images? Is there an attempt frame that, so like, you know, breaking of human understanding or regaining of human understanding in a meta way? So again, more problems and questions than doesn't.
No, that's great, Lada. And you know, it sounds like you would say no.
I don't know. That manuscript is an open question to me. Like I always,
No, I've been fascinated by it. You've probably seen it in person. I have not in person, in the flesh. I haven't seen this manuscript in the flesh. But I think to me, what is so his version of it is precisely his grounding here, which is the point I was trying to make. You know, and these earthly correspondences. That's what he really focuses on. I mean, we get these people floating in their little, spheres, but it's really for the reader who is reading it here, and to make sense of that conversation. You know, what they're saying impacts us here today in this. So I think the metaphysics is something that he doesn't really care much about, to be honest with you. And then the question becomes, in what way is he expanding text, which is your question. So that's great. I mean, I'll be thinking about that a lot. Sense of expansiveness was just ways in which he was giving us such what seemed like a personalized and often just really weird version. Often, what occupied the illumination was a simile. I mean, he would use a simile to say, "Oh, let's ground this," in the text. So he's materializing a simile, which in and of itself is really interesting, right? It's embodying something which it's only a simile. It's not really in the text, but that's what he chooses to focus on. But again, I think he's doing that mainly again to kind of ground the manuscript in our hands. So I will think about that though. Really great. I mean, I was hoping that there would be instances in the illuminations like moments of dance and a song. There really aren't. He's not going to that multimedial space. He's more interested in like the visualization and the embodiment of what we as earthly readers can process, I think. But I'd love to talk to you more about it. Manuel, I know you're an opera lover, so if you have any thoughts on the editing. And again, I took up so much of your time. I really apologize. Laura, did you have something?
Thank you again for yet another great talk, and see you all next week.
Great. Thanks to all of you for hanging in there. Thank you.